Welcome back into the Lions 247 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue, episode 2 of game week number 6 for the Penn State Nittany Lions. They'll finish this week out in Los Angeles. They will head out there on Thursday, play on Saturday afternoon, 12:30 local time, 3:30 p.m. Happy Valley time, facing a 3-2 USC squad. We're going to learn a lot more about this Trojans team a little bit later on this episode. We'll welcome a USC insider from our 247 Sports Network to break down where that squad is coming into the matchup. Obviously, many of us, and I think I called it on the postgame podcast last Saturday, a likely top 10 showdown. Lo and behold, Penn State's number 4 in the country, but USC is technically 26th at the top of the others receiving votes pile after suffering an upset loss in Minneapolis on Saturday night. Their second loss of their Big Ten schedule also fell to Michigan in September. We will break down USC, the highs, the lows, the strengths, the weaknesses, and what things are kind of feeling like right now for Lincoln Riley, the head coach out there, 5-7 in his last 12 games. We'll get a good picture of the perception and the pressure around this USC program in just a little while. But we spent a lot of time discussing what went down between Penn State and UCLA on the field. We had our post-game podcast Saturday, came back on Monday, fresh out of James Franklin's press conference at Beaver Stadium. Mark Brennan, Daniel Gallen, myself broke down the latest updates from that. We went back and talked about some top takeaways from that victory over the Bruins. But now, what was going on in the stands? What was going on in the recruiting lounge? We'll talk about that now with Tyler Calvaruso, because the 4th consecutive matchup in Beaver Stadium early on in this 2024 schedule was yet another opportunity to bring top targets into Happy Valley. There were a few of them who are committed to other programs in this 2025 cycle. There were a bunch of top 247 recruits from the 2026 cycle on campus. So a lot to get to you with you, Tyler.
You know, really, it turned out to be a pretty important weekend for Penn State. It just, given the schedule being what it is, where October from here on out, it's going to be a quiet month in Happy Valley when it comes to hosting recruits on campus and getting recruits to Beaver Stadium. So this weekend presented Penn State with a situation where if you were going to get your top flip targets back to town in a timely manner, it was going to be the UCLA game. And that happened. You know, quartet of top flip targets. Penn State really wants to get on board, make it to campus. You've got some top targets in that 2026 class that made it to campus. Some pretty intriguing 27s and even some 28s as well. So it was a weekend that, despite the opponent not carrying the most juice, being, you know, UCLA what it is this season, despite the noon kickoff, which makes things a little bit difficult for some guys, it was a pretty healthy visitors list. And when we look back at it, based on some of the names that we're going to get into that made it to campus regarding the 25 class, this could go down. It's crazy to say because Ohio State's still on the schedule and the whiteout against Washington still on the schedule. When we look back at this, once the early signing period rolls around, this weekend could be one of the more important weekends, arguably the most important recruiting weekend Penn State had in the 2024 college football season, just given the gravity of the names that were on campus.
Well, let's get to one of the bigger ones. That's Lex Cyrus. He's a premier prospect in the state of Pennsylvania out of Harrisburg. He went and committed to South Carolina back in July. We spent a lot of time coming off of that commitment, breaking down why it was a big miss for Penn State and receivers coach Marcus Higgins. But we said back then, we'll keep tabs on this one all the way through. Still committed to the Gamecocks down there in South Carolina, but on Saturday, he was back in Beaver Stadium. He was shaking hands with James Franklin. He was soaking in the atmosphere. What do we make of getting the number 34 recruit in the country at his position, wide receiver, the number 8 player in the state of Pennsylvania among current seniors back in State College?
First things first, Penn State never quit on Lex Cyrus. Even after his commitment, the desire to get him on board in this 25 class remained in place. And you got to keep in mind, too, going back to the original part of his recruitment coming out of the summer, where he committed to South Carolina over the Nittany Lions, there were still people close to Cyrus in his camp that want to see him in Happy Valley. And a lot of those opinions have not changed. You know, Lex has been locked in with South Carolina for a little while now. You're starting to see that receiver class at South Carolina kind of blow up in terms of numbers. The reclassification of Donovan Murph from the 26 class to 25 class, he was a target for Penn State. You know, with him being in the 25 class now, if he lands at South Carolina, the numbers game out South Carolina at wide receivers in a much different place now than it was at the time of Cyrus's commitment. I think that might play a little bit of a part into where we are right now, talking about Cyrus coming off a visit to Penn State. And you've seen the prioritization from Penn State. James Franklin making it out to Susquehanna Township game to see Cyrus play right before his visit. Nittany Lions want to get this one done. Staff's been pushing hard. Marcus Hagan's been working this one really hard behind the scenes. The feedback coming out of his visit has been positive, and moving forward, this is really all these guys, but with Cyrus especially, given his in-state ties, the placement on the board from the start, really going back to last summer when he impressed at Whiteout Camp, earned his offer. He's been a top guy for Hagan's for more than a year now. The commitment to South Carolina did not change that level of wanting Lex Cyrus to be a Penn State Nittany Lion. And hey, look, wouldn't it be something if after flipping Matthew Allen, you go out and you potentially get Lex Cyrus, you get both of those guys after missing during the summer? That'd be one heck of a heel turn from Hagan's and the staff.
Yeah, Matthew Allen, of course, another four-star prospect. He committed to Virginia Tech in the summer. He has since come on board with the Nittany Lions, and you're right. There was a lot of angst around those two misses, and they've got one of them in the fold. And now we'll see about Cyrus. He has 19 touchdown catches since the start of his junior season. He's having a really strong campaign now as a senior. And I just want to, before we move on to some of these other names, it's only a 5-game sample size, but are you getting the sense that the narrative around Marcus Hagan's receiver recruiting, because of what's been produced on the football field, has evolved a bit? And what has been produced on the football field, 3 different receivers in that room have 100-yard games through 5 games. Liam Clifford, Omari Evans, Harrison Wallace. We have seen Julian Fleming pop up with some splash plays in the last couple of weeks. And so it hasn't been like last year. It felt like Keandre Lambert-Smith, and if Harrison Wallace wasn't healthy, you weren't sure what else you were getting there. Is there steps forward here on the recruiting trail? Because we've seen steps forward from an on-field perspective.
Yeah, I think from my conversations with prospects at the position, prospects who are high on the board at that, I do think the vibe has been a bit more positive than it was maybe at this time last year, where Penn State's wide receiver play and the production wasn't quite where it is now. You're also seeing a lot of praise for Andy Kotelnicki and his ability to scheme guys open and his overall offense. I think personally, from my conversations, that's really what I'm drawing on here. The overall vibe surrounding Penn State's offense from recruits is much more positive than it was at this time last year. So, yeah, I think Hagan's developmental ability, when you're seeing players who, maybe took a back seat last year, wasn't quite as productive last year, producing at a higher level in 2024, you take that year-to-year development as a recruit. You look at that and say, hey, look, Hagan's could get those guys to a place where they are producing in a new offense. Maybe he could take me to that place, develop my skill set, get me to where I want to be, and get me to be a productive member of this Penn State offense. So, yeah, I do think that overall, and again, it's still early. You still got to think of the Big Ten schedule to go through. Got a big-time matchup against USC coming up. So the jury is still out, but the initial intel reaction, however you want to put it, I think it's been better. I think it's in a better place now.
When we go over to the other side of Pennsylvania and focus in on Pittsburgh Central Catholic linebacker Bradley Gompers, this one has accelerated pretty fast. He's been committed to Duke for a while, but Penn State has been in communication, recently put out an offer, and as the reporting has suggested at Lions 247, they didn't put out that offer thinking they didn't have an opportunity in that situation. They've already flipped one player from Manny Diaz's class down at Duke, adding Cam Smith, linebacker out of St. Joe's Prep in Philadelphia. Here's another. It's a familiar school. Central Catholic is where you would have found this time last year Peter Gonzalez and Anthony Specca, who are both now freshmen with Penn State. That's where Xavier Thomas is. He's a defensive back committed to Penn State's 2025 class. So, much like I said with Cyrus, I know the motto is the best in the state, stay in the state. Do you think that Penn State has kind of pushed forward toward making that a reality with Gompers versus him ultimately heading down to Durham and joining Manny Diaz?
Well, James Franklin can't get enough of those Central Catholic guys, right? He's going to keep the best in PA. Central Catholic, different level for him. He wants all those guys, and he's pushing to get this one done with Gompers. And again, another deal where feedback from the visit has been positive. And on the surface, you look at the recruitment, you see the offer going out, you see Penn State's past success at Central Catholic, not just getting guys, but, developing them and really helping them improve at the next level once they arrive in Happy Valley. On the surface, you think, oh, man, this is a really nice situation for Penn State. And it is a nice situation for Penn State. But I think what Nittany Lions fans need to keep in mind is Gompers being locked in with Duke since June 16th was the date that he committed to the Blue Devils. He really, really likes Manny Diaz. That plays a big part in this as well. It was never Gomper's recruitment, really, even though he missed a lot of his junior year and that limited the evaluation process. It was never a matter of, committing to Duke and locking in a spot in a class and then hoping more P4 offers would come along from quote unquote bigger programs, right? He really, really likes Manny Diaz, likes Gabe Infante, likes the staff in Durham. A bunch of familiarity there, given those guys, a lot of those guys were at Penn State with Diaz, part of that defensive staff. So we're going to have to see where this one goes. I think Penn State has put itself in the spot to make a move for sure. Will that move happen? Again, for me, it's going to come down to this. Is the affinity for Manny Diaz, is that going to win out? Or is the allure of playing local, playing for Penn State, big-time program in your own state? You've got good relationships with the staff in State College in your own right. Which aspect of Gomper's recruitment is going to win out? And it's going to be a pretty interesting battle to monitor really up until the beginning of the early signing period on December 4th.
Penn State's 2025 recruiting class features 7 of the top 20 players in the state of Pennsylvania. With Gompers and with Cyrus, you're talking about number 7 and number 8 on that list, respectively. Gompers number 26 nationally among linebackers. And as we said, Cyrus number 34 nationally among wide receivers. Going beyond the Pennsylvania turf here, but staying within the Penn State footprint and down at the McDonough School in Maryland. Look, Brendan Finney was back in town, and his commitment is one that turned a lot of heads back in June. But we're going through some of the lowlights of the summer recruiting for Penn State right now as we're working our way through these commitment flip possibilities. But Finney committed to Oregon in late June. A lot of folks, I think yourself included, had a sense that Penn State was in that driver's seat until the 11th hour. And he ends up committing to Oregon. He's a guy whose trajectory has been clearly pointing upward. He's in the top 100 overall in our rankings at 247 Sports. He's the number 11 cornerback in the class of 2025. And he didn't have to look far to find some familiarity down there on the field. You've got Kenny Sanders, who runs the show for recruiting. He's a McDonough alum. You've got 2 starters out there for the Penn State defense, Denai Dennis Sutton and Devon J. Thomas. They're both from McDonough. Of course, Mason Robinson's a redshirt freshman defensive end from that program. And in the past, we saw guys like Curtis Jacobs and PJ Mustipher shine as starters with the Nittany Lions from that same high school program. So, man, I don't think there's a lot of familiarity lacking here, but what did it mean to get Finney back on campus and have him maybe reminded about some of the draw here in Happy Valley?
So I'd pinpoint Finney, and I know we just talked about 2 in-state guys Penn State really likes, but I'd pinpoint Finney as the biggest flip target that visited over the weekend. And really, there's just so much that goes into that distinction for me. Got the McDonough ties. That's a program Penn State is always going to recruit. And they recruit it quite well. Going back to the summer, I mean, full disclosure, I thought Penn State was going to get Finney. Really leading up to that decision, we didn't hear a whole lot indicating that it wasn't going to be the Nittany Lions. It seemed like Penn State was at a pretty good spot, but Oregon made that 11th hour push, as you mentioned, got him on board. And from that point on, Penn State has continued working on him. Getting him back to campus was always the goal. That happened over the weekend, and it was very, very important. Getting him back to campus was crucial because he had already been to Michigan for a visit in September, and that was pretty notable in a couple different senses. Not only is he popping up at a Big Ten rival, Michigan got involved in Finney's recruitment later in the game, so that wiped out the possibility for a summer official visit as he got to know the staff in Ann Arbor. That's going to be coming up later this fall, and with Finney, given the fact that he has so many high-quality suitors, not to mention Oregon, Penn State pushing, Michigan pushing, Oregon trying to keep him on board, getting him back to campus was crucial. Staff did that. And Finney has always had that good relationship with Terry Smith, has always had the feeling that Terry Smith is a coach that could really take his game to the next level if he were to, really work under him in the collegiate ranks. So Penn State is going to try to get Finney back again. In a perfect world, they get him back to campus again before the beginning of the early sign period because they're not going to give up on this one until he puts pen to paper. It's not going to be easy, though. It's really not going to be an easy flip to generate. As strong as the relationships are, Penn State's ties at McDonough, as strong as those ties are, this is not going to be an easy one. But I'd classify Saturday as a pretty positive first step for Penn State, getting him back on campus. Maybe not a first step since this has been going on for a while and the effort has been being put in for months, but it was an important step, that's for sure.
Yeah, the top 100 overall status should pique a lot of interest out there among our listeners and viewers. But I'll throw this out there too: the comp we were hearing on the camp circuit this year, Joey Porter Jr., who had a damn good career here in a Nittany Lions uniform. So Finney has drawn some comparisons. One more flip candidate to get to. There were 4 of them who are currently committed to other programs that spent time at Penn State watching them beat UCLA. And the 4th is Josh Johnson out of Ironton, Ohio. Again, one of those players that we were monitoring in the summer months. He ended up coming off the board to Louisville in mid-June. But again, resurfacing in Happy Valley mid-season.
Yeah, this is one we really thought was going to get done for Penn State in the summer, and that was one that caught a lot of people by surprise. But with Penn State monitoring that safety position really closely, with Antonio Branch defecting for Colorado, asking around, you get the sense that things started to pick up with Johnson again more here recently, and his positional versatility has always been a pretty big talking point for us when it comes to Johnson. His ability to play cornerback, he can play safety. Now you're seeing a role, really a spot being carved out for him potentially at safety if he wants to take it. And again, asking around coming out of this visit, I do feel, I'm not sure optimism is necessarily the right way to put it, but there are people who feel pretty good about Penn State's chances to make a move here on Johnson before he signs somewhere. So this is one that we've been monitoring a bunch of flip situations for a while. Really, all the guys that we've talked about, Zahir Mathis, the Ohio State commit, Andrew Olish, the Michigan tight end commit. We've been monitoring a bunch of guys. Johnson's a little bit newer to the equation, at least publicly, because Penn State had circled back on this one, seeing if it could make a move. They invited him to the game on Saturday. He decided to make the trip. That was really the biggest surprise of the weekend since we'd been tracking the 3 other guys. So Johnson popping up was definitely a surprise, but Penn State was happy to get him back. And now that they did get him back, there's definitely a feeling that this one could get done.
Yeah, there are 4 names to monitor now, and then the next couple of months between now and National Signing Day in December. And as you said, there's other flip candidates, but those 4 were actually in Beaver Stadium just a couple days ago. Let's focus on some others who made the trip to campus for Saturday's matchup and in the 2026 class, which is really the vocal point when you talk about Penn State's recruiting efforts right now. Of course, they're trying to get to the finish line, keep those commits comfortable, maybe add some pieces in the 2025 cycle. But that 2026 group with the high school juniors right now really taking shape, and 3 top 24/7 prospects are in our spotlight here on the podcast. Jordan Thomas, defensive back out of New Jersey, is where you wanted to start.
Yeah, one of those DBs that Terry Smith likes a lot, Penn State likes a lot overall. We just mentioned Johnson with positional versatility. Thomas has that as well. I like him at corner. I've seen him in person, in action at corner. There are some people who think he could be a safety at the next level. Either way, Penn State and a bunch of other P4 programs like his skill set got him back to town for the first time in a little more than a year. The spring game last year was his most recent visit before Saturday, and he got invited back, said he and his family, he got back. In the whiteout was his last visit, not the spring game. Yeah. And his family really enjoyed that experience against Iowa. And he wanted to experience another Penn State home game. He wanted to get back, and he wanted to see what that defense under Tom Allen was looking like. He wanted to see the utilization of the DBs, and really everything worked in Penn State's favor in that regard. Thomas told me that the Nittany Lions are really in place as one of his top choices at this point in his recruitment. He's open to returning to campus. So it's tough for him to get visits in sometimes because Bergen Catholic plays its home games on Saturdays, and a lot of those other Big North Super Conference programs in New Jersey, they tend to play their home games on Saturday as well. So when Thomas can get out and make a Saturday visit, it's notable. He had the chance to go other places, decided on Penn State, along with a lot of his other Bergen Catholic teammates that were invited to campus. And I think Penn State's building in the right direction here.
Another name on that 2026 defensive target board is Carter Meadows out of Washington, D.C. powerhouse Gonzaga High School. What do we need to know about him coming off this latest visit to Happy Valley?
The most important thing is he's in that upper echelon for Deion Barnes when it comes to 2026 defensive line targets. He is very much wanted coming off the edge. Good visit. I think that there's a long way to go in this one. Meadows is going to continue to get out, take visits. He's been to Penn State multiple times in his recruitment, so that's a positive for the Nittany Lions. When it comes to the prospect, I mean, man, he's an elite athlete. He's a legitimate Division I basketball talent as well. He's a legit 6'6". So his tools, I mean, he just oozes potential. That's really the biggest reason why Barnes and the staff like him so much. They love him. The measurables are exactly where they need to be. The athletic testing numbers are exactly where they need to be for him to be a potentially elite player at the next level. This was another one. We talked about the flip targets, wanting to get certain guys back to campus in a timely manner before this really almost a month-long lull. Meadows fell into that category in the 26th class, and with him making it to campus, it was an opportunity for Barnes and the staff keep building that relationship and say, hey, look, we really, really want you. We want you to keep coming back, and we're going to keep pushing until the end.
The other top 24/7 four-star talent we wanted to get to here on the offensive side of the ball, Virginia wide receiver Travis Johnson. I know he also is somebody that Lions 24/7 tracked down coming off his trip.
Yeah, really familiar name for Penn State fans at this point. At least he should be. He's visited a bunch as an underclassman. He's got that long-standing relationship with Marcus Hagan since Hagan's tried to recruit his older brother TJ to play for him at the University of Virginia. TJ's now at West Virginia. And even though it didn't go Hagan's way with his older brother, Travis has given Penn State a really long look. He likes Hagan's. The family likes and trusts Hagan. So when you could have that kind of built-in advantage, that always works in your favor. Another, again, where the feedback was, hey, look, Penn State's one of my top choices coming out of this visit, and he's going to look to return to campus probably during the winter. It's possible that he pops up again later in the fall. It will really depend on his schedule and where he wants to go, because another guy is going to have opportunities to visit a lot of other programs. He's a really talented wideout. Penn State already has 2 in that 26 class. Marcus Hagans has the Nittany Lions involved with a lot of the top wideouts in Virginia. Johnson's arguably the best of the bunch.
We will continue to assess the impact of the 4-game homestand that Penn State just had here in Happy Valley moving forward. Maybe we'll do a midseason look at some stock up players for Penn State on their target board because of the impact of those visits. But they're not quite done yet, Tyler. 3 home games coming our way here in November after Penn State hits the road, goes to USC, takes a bye week, and then hits the road again out at Wisconsin. The first, of course, the long-awaited matchup against Ohio State. If Penn State can make it through a next couple road trips unscathed, we're talking about what will be at least a top 5 showdown. It could be maybe 1 versus number 2, depending on how things go across the country. But it's a big matchup, and I know that we've already got some confirmations coming in. Why don't you give us a couple that we've already got to know about for that Ohio State November 2nd matchup?
Yeah, that's a hot ticket. And if it comes to fruition where you get that top 5 matchup, man, that ticket's going to get even hotter. It's going to be on fire once November rolls around. But so far, really some really standout prospects have confirmed their plans to attend, both in Virginia, ironically, as we just finished out there with Travis Johnson. Savion Hyder, the top elite running back in the 26th class. He's going to be back on campus for the first time in a while. That's a big visit for Penn State. Penn State loves Hyder, and if there's a guy they really want to pair with Messiah and make into that 26 backfield, Hyder is the one. A lot of top competition there. Penn State's fighting the fight. And then at wide receiver, top 24/7 wideout, Connor Salmon, who tested really, really well at Penn State. He's running 10.4 in the 100. He's running the 40 in that 4.3, 4.4 range. Really just an elite athlete. You're seeing that on the field this fall, that athleticism turning into some high-level production. He's high on that board for Hagans. He's going to be back for the Ohio State game. Actually just saw the Buckeyes play this past weekend. Going to get another look at Ohio State. Going to get another look at Penn State. It's a visit he's really excited for. And those 2, that's just the tip of the iceberg, man. There are a bunch of other guys who have confirmed their plans early on, and that list is going to grow exponentially in the coming weeks.
And those updates will be found at lions247.com throughout this month. And remember, after that weekend, it's the official whiteout with Washington visiting, and Washington just knocked off Michigan out on its home stadium. They'll be coming November 9th. Tyler, before we say goodbye, and then next week we're going to talk about some midseason topics, a little more big picture stuff with recruiting. But let's focus in on what's ahead of us. And we're going to turn our attention to USC with one of their insiders in our 24/7 Sports Network in a couple of minutes. But I want to hear from you. What would it mean for Penn State to go on the road out to Los Angeles? We know they've been hitting Southern California harder than normal with more success than ever on the recruiting trail, to improve the 6-0 out there and then get into a bye week and be able to go out and showcase the program on the road. What is on the line here for Penn State if they can, in fact, reach 6-0?
I think it's big, man, because you're starting to see Penn State recruit California better and better. You're seeing this 25 class, the guys who are on board, Darius Dixon, LeVar Arrington II. You're seeing the 26 class with Troy Hune. And I touched on it when we were talking about Madden Williams' visit coming out of the Illinois game. Getting these guys to campuses for visits is crucial. Getting eyes on Penn State in action is crucial. And now with this new Big Ten landscape, you have an opportunity to go out onto the West Coast and impress some of the top prospects on the West Coast and in California specifically in a way that you previously would not have been able to do. It just wasn't something that was on the docket. It wasn't going to be possible unless you went out and scheduled a non-conference game against the Trojans out in LA. So, yeah, I think if Penn State was to go to USC and win, and not only just win, but if they're able to pull off a win in resounding fashion, I do think it would be a pretty big statement for the Nittany Lions from a recruiting perspective, because you're already starting to see them do better and better again with these California kids. If you can go to California and beat, if you're just beating UCLA too at home, and beat a good USC team, I know they fell against Minnesota over the weekend. It's not a top 25 matchup anymore, but there is still so much on the line here from Penn State, from an on-field perspective and from a recruiting perspective as well. That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Hollywood is Big Ten territory at this point, man.
Yep.
So we'll see how Penn State can take advantage of it. Tyler, really appreciate the perspective. Please follow his coverage at lions247.com. Plenty of feedback from those UCLA game visitors. A lot more to come over the course of this month. And when that bye week does hit, we'll have a lot of updates on where those coaches are heading, who they're prioritizing, where they're getting out to across the country. Tyler, we'll talk to you real soon.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
This episode of the Lions 247 podcast continues with perspective from Los Angeles. That's where Penn State's heading this week to take on the USC Trojans. This is a game that many people have had circled for a while with the merger between these Big Ten conference schools, the old school ones, and then the new ones, the transplants from the Pac-12. We got our first look at those transplants last week in State College when the Bruins came to town. Penn State handled business against UCLA, but a tougher task is expected in the Coliseum against USC. And to help us break down that, Abeytia joins the Lions 247 podcast. He joined us back in the summer when we were taking an early look towards some of Penn State's more interesting opponents. I think USC certainly still fits the bill as interesting. Maybe not the marquee matchup we thought it was going to be about 72 hours ago, but RJ, welcome back in. And I'm a little jealous you're doing this podcast outside in the sunshine of LA, but we're happy to have you. And like I said to you, that's Big Ten territory now.
Yeah, I'm happy to let the stereotypes live on with as much evidence as I can provide. Yeah, no, it's I think it's heading towards 85, 86 at some point today. Luckily, it's not that. I wouldn't be outdoors if it was that. But yeah, no, the Nittany Lions are in for what they expect. I think weather-wise, when they come out here on Saturday, it should be a pretty warm Southern California day.
There's been a lot of conversation this week about the travel schedule. Penn State's leaving a day earlier than they normally would. They're flying out of the Harrisburg airport, which is, an hour and a half-ish away from campus versus just flying out of the State College airport because of the larger plane that they're required to use. And so we've been talking about it, the logistics from our standpoint. What does it look like in Los Angeles right now? The fact that the Penn State Nittany Lions are coming to town. It's not a bowl game. It's not the Rose Bowl. It's just a regular season conference matchup, and here comes Penn State.
I think it's about as anticipated a regular season game as we've had. I mean, obviously USC plays a lot of anticipated games like that, but this is a top 5 team. I think Penn State has established itself as a top program. This is a name program with a name coach, and it's exciting. And obviously, it's just human instinct. It's hard not to think back to that classic Rose Bowl, which is a lot longer in the past now than I think feels. It feels like that game was a little more recently, but that was obviously one of the most memorable Rose Bowl games, even for a USC team that's had nothing but memorable Rose Bowl games. So yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement. I think the logistic questions are always interesting and fascinating, both ends of it. I think the reality is, for example, Rutgers is playing an 8 p.m. Pacific game at USC in a few weeks. To me, that's more of a conversation because that's Rutgers kicking off at 11 p.m. Rutgers time, right? Penn State's going to be kicking this game off at 3:30 Penn State time. I don't know what they're normally doing, what their practice schedule is like, but that's pretty manageable body wise. So I'm sure whatever they're doing to get ready for it, I don't think that's going to be much of a factor on Saturday.
No, I agree with you. And I think ultimately we're just going to get used to matchups like this, but we're certainly not there yet in 2024. And it has been 7 years and about 9 months since these teams played in that Rose Bowl. So very different complexions on both sides, but the head coach remains the same here in James Franklin. There's been multiple changes for USC, and Lincoln Riley came to town a couple of years ago with a lot of fanfare, moving on from Oklahoma. Caleb Williams followed him, an eventual Heisman Trophy winner, number 1 overall draft pick there with USC. But when you and I spoke this offseason, it was very clear that there was some concern of what the product might look like when they hit the Big Ten Conference. And right off the bat, I think USC opened a lot of eyes, winning against LSU in that Week 1 showdown, an exciting game. Miller Moss balled out, picking up where he left off in that bowl game last year. But now here we are, 3-2 on the season is USC. Couple losses in the Big Ten Conference, one on the road against Michigan by 3 points. The other, more stinging, last Saturday night by 7 points, 24-17 at Minnesota. And it sure felt like, RJ, we were on the doorstep of talking about a top 10 matchup brewing in the Coliseum. Now USC slumps into this thing unranked. What is the mood right now out for this program?
I think the funny thing is I think the mood will be much easier to gauge after this game, because I think USC has put itself in a position where they're at 1-2 in the conference. They went from number 11 to not ranked. So I think it's a pretty safe bet. Had they beaten Minnesota, this would be like a 5 versus 9, 5 versus 8. This would be that matchup you're talking about. And it's not anymore. And what it is now is an unranked USC team coming off like you said, a stinging loss. I think that's a perfect word for it. Looking to make something happen against a ranked Penn State team. Coming out, traveling, home underdog. We all know how dangerous that can be. So really, like, my sense of it is, I think USC is waiting to see what they do. I'm not sure that there's certainly not arrogance. I think they know how good Penn State is. I think they're going to take that field on Saturday with a little bit of doubt and a little bit of questions. And it's one of those things where they certainly have talent. So it's one of those things where, if you're Penn State and the game is close after 1 quarter, suddenly USC's only 3 quarters away from pulling the thing off, right? If it's close at halftime, now they're just a half away from beating a top 5 team. You know what I mean? And they've got enough talent where if it turns into that level of belief in the game, I think they can make something happen. I don't know that they're walking into the stadium with that level of belief based on the way that they've played in the 2 losses.
I'm just really curious what team is going to show up. Is it going to be a team that says, hey, if we run the table, we can still get to the playoff. We can still, kind of map our own destiny. Or is it a team that feels like, well, we felt really good about ourselves early on. Now we've taken a couple punches. Here comes Penn State. We're going to pick up a 3rd loss. I just don't know. And I guess that a lot of it comes down to Lincoln Riley. And as the head coach of this team, 5-7 in his last 12 games. I know that's been referenced quite a bit here since they lost to Minnesota. What kind of a situation is Riley dealing with now at USC in terms of keeping the confidence not only of his locker room, but of the fan base, of the boosters, of the people who rolled out that red carpet a couple years ago?
Well, I think it's, again, kind of what we talked about before. It's those Big Ten. It's a lot of the stereotypes kind of come to life, because the issue for USC right now on both sides of the ball is very clearly at the line of scrimmage. The offensive line is not protecting Miller Moss with enough consistency. They're also not, they put up some deceptive run numbers. If you look in that Minnesota game, I wrote an article about that and talked a little bit about how that was a little bit misleading. But they're not manhandling people up front, nor would you expect them. They've played Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin to start play, and they're going to play another good front on Saturday, obviously. And then on the other side of the ball, just not imposing their will defensively at the line of scrimmage, which I think, again, is what everyone thought would be the problem. And it's kind of materialized as USC has stepped into Big Ten play. And there's a couple things about that. If you look at you look at UC, Penn State just played UCLA, right? And although I think Penn State pretty clearly controlled that game, I think there was some positivity on the UCLA front just because they played that game with a reconfigured offensive line, and they felt like it was a little bit better than what they had been getting, especially considering the quality of opponent and venue last Saturday. USC doesn't have that kind of pivot. They don't have a ton of offensive line shuffling, and they don't have depth. So it's the situation where it's hard to drum up a lot of positivity just because the guys who have struggled have to get better. And it's hard to get a lot better in 6 days. So I think, again, like I said, I think the team has, even though they've never admitted, I think they have kind of a wait and see approach. And I think that's what the fans are thinking. I mean, you've got to see this team hold up at the line of scrimmage through 4 quarters of a Big Ten game before you can believe that they can do it. And they haven't shown that they can do it yet.
Yeah, when I kind of marry the trajectories in the trenches for these teams, what Penn State's been doing lately on the defensive front, what USC has not been doing lately on the offensive front, it could really spell disaster for Miller Moss. But he's a guy that I know has risen to the occasion in some key moments. Last year, everyone was, what would the future look like at quarterback without Caleb Williams? He goes out, he throws 6 touchdowns in the Holiday Bowl for USC. The opener this year, away from home, goes out, plays a very clean game, almost 400 passing yards in a victory over LSU. He had 3 touchdowns on the road at Michigan a few weeks ago. He had 3 touchdowns at home in a win over Wisconsin a couple weeks ago. A couple interceptions at Minneapolis. Would you kind of give us the updated progress report on Miller Moss and how he's handling being the next man up after a guy who is going to go down as a legendary program figure in Caleb Williams?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing about this USC team is, in terms of mental and physical toughness, I think the very last player who needs to face any questions is Miller Moss. To be honest with you, if you've watched him play, you referenced the Michigan game. I mean, there was a pick 6 in that game that was actually the result of a misrun route, but it's a pick 6 nonetheless, and that's a pretty traumatizing event in the big house, in that scenario, in that type of a situation. He came back with 2 touchdown passes, including a gorgeous throw on a 3rd and 16 to Jacoby Lane, and put them in position to win the game. And he's not the question. USC has to get tougher pretty much everywhere else but quarterback. If you're talking about the offense, the offensive line's got to get tougher. The receivers have got to get tougher. I think you look in that Minnesota game, and we've been talking a lot about the pass rush and the pressure. But if you look at the back end of what Minnesota was able to do on defensively, they were very physical with USC's wide receivers. PJ Fleck referenced that after the game as kind of a key to what they were able to do. And again, we're pushing back into kind of those West Coast stereotypes, and certainly USC has enough history and wins to show that it can push past those stereotypes at its best. But this team hasn't done that yet, and they've got to get to that place. You're not gonna dial up acres of wide open space against good Big Ten defenses. You're certainly not going to do it against a Penn State team that is elite at rushing the passer. So you've got to make contested catches. You got to win some of those 50-50 balls. So as far as Miller Moss goes, I think that he's the least questionable part of this team at this point. In fact, his toughness and a lot of what he's done is holding the group together. What needs to happen is everyone else kind of needs to step up on offense.
When we look at that supporting cast, 7 guys are over 100 receiving yards through 5 games. That's a pretty big number. You got a couple running backs involved. Who are the playmakers when Miller Moss is looking for help, looking to find a spark? Who does Penn State's defense need to be hyper aware of on Saturday afternoon?
I'll give you the 2 kind of headline guys, and then one kind of not surprise guy, but one under the radar guy who they should really look at. Jacoby Lane has made a bunch of big catches this year. He's made a bunch of big plays. He's someone Miller Moss certainly trusts on the outside. If it's one-on-one, Moss is going to read that as one on none. He's going to give Jacoby Lane a chance to make that play. And he's been one of the guys who has made a little bit more of those plays than some of the others. As a running back, Woody Marks has been good. He's been opportunistic in the run game, and he's been a consistent pass receiver as well. He's also been an improved guy as a pass blocker, so he's helped out a little bit in that regard. Those are the two guys who I think you start your scout with if you're Penn State. The under the radar guy I would say is Mekhi Lemon, and I'm saying under the radar even though he was a 5-star receiver, but he got dinged up in the Michigan game, and they haven't had him. And Moss has a really good comfort level with him, and he's a really good player. He's just a no-nonsense player. He knows how to run routes. He understands the offense. He will make tough catches, and he's athletic. He made some good plays in the Minnesota game in his first game back. So those are the three guys that I would say you kind of start with. I think the real other kind of mystery element here is, tight end Lake McCree was lost for an extended period of time a few games back, and the tight end had just started to become something that was a part of what Moss and the offense was doing, and they haven't really had that in the last couple of games, and McCree's not going to be back for this game either. So another thing to look for is USC just going to shelve that tight end component, because it was something that was really helping Moss out and the offense, and obviously it gives opponents one more thing to prepare for. So those are the things, those are the boxes I think you got to check first if you're talking about dealing with the USC offense on Saturday.
Another player that James Franklin mentioned in his Monday press conference, called him a threat on offense and special teams, sophomore Zachariah Branch, a wide receiver as well, another name to file away for this matchup. Defensively, there was a lot of conversation this offseason about D'Anton Lynn making the move from UCLA, right within the city. He did a lot of good things for the Bruins last year. The anticipation was it was going to be a turnaround effort for USC, because that was so often nightmarish for them last year, defense, leading to the firing of their last defensive coordinator. Lynn is a former Penn State player. Folks around here have monitored his progress as a coach. He has ascended pretty rapidly. Many believe he's a future head coach. How is it going so far under this kind of reclamation project for USC's defense, and how prepared do you think they are for Penn State?
I think there's undeniable improvement. You can't really slice it in the macro sense. There's no other way to say it, but they have taken a step forward. Now, from where they were, there was really no direction for them to go but forward still. But I think he's done a really good job. I think what's better about USC this year, there's two things that are reasonably important. I think number one thing that they're doing better is they're getting off the field on third down. They're a better third down defense. So, if you're the Nittany Lions and you look at kind of the way you like to operate, that's a downhill team. That's a team that wants third and short and keeps living there. You know what I mean? And Drew Aller's shown plenty of what he can do, but they don't want him to throw the ball 40 times. I think that's pretty clear. And I think what USC has been able to do is get teams off the field on third down, even as they give up yardage along the way. And the other thing that they've done better this year is tackling in the secondary. A lot of what Lynn has done has been predicated on trusting one-on-one tacklers on the perimeter to finish plays in terms of bringing extra pressure numbers sometimes if you need it, doing other kinds of stuff up front. That took a step back in the Minnesota game. The USC secondary struggled to tackle, and it cost them. And it was really kind of the first time all year that was a glaring issue. So those areas, I think he's definitely moved forward. I think the rest of what you need to see or want to see in terms of this reclamation project has to come over time. It has to come with better players. Like right now, USC, I should say, USC doesn't have dominant players in the front seven, and they especially don't have them on the line. So what does that lead to? It leads to a couple of things. It leads to wearing down at the end of games against the run, and it leads to a lack of a pass rush. And, Max Brosmer and Braden Locke are perfectly fine quarterbacks, but I don't think anybody would consider them superstars or top level quarterbacks at this point. But it doesn't matter who's back there to a certain extent if you're not getting home. And that has manifested itself. I mean, if you can even look at the most extreme example of the Michigan game. Michigan didn't even try to pass.
We've seen that before. Trust me, we've seen that before.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a familiar thing, but it's a little bit frustrating when the only path to winning is Michigan running the ball if you're USC, and you still can't stop it. And that's kind of where they're at right now, and that's kind of where they have to improve it and find better answers. If you look at, again, the Minnesota and Michigan losses were tough, but they didn't lose them 42-10. In fact, they had fourth quarter leads in both those games. So they've got to find answers in terms of depth and in terms of having some steam left at the end of these games to finish them. And the hope, obviously, for USC is that it is a close game in the fourth quarter on Saturday. I'm not totally sure that's going to be the case, but that's the blueprint, and that's kind of the state of affairs. So yeah, I think D'Anton Lynn has done as much as could be done with this group, but I think at a certain point it does become more about the personnel than the schemes.
And just to add to your commentary, USC has collected 6 sacks through 5 games. It's just not going to get the job done. And 2 of those belong to Eric Gentry, who was a big-time recruit coming out of high school. USC viewed him as a pivotal piece of what it wanted to accomplish defensively, but he's working with an injury. So any update on Gentry's status? And in terms of potential defensive game wreckers, doesn't sound like there's been many of them flashing on the field of late, but are there some other names that maybe we should be aware of? And more importantly, Andy Kotelnicki and Drew Aller should be aware of.
Yeah, I think the Gentry loss is big. I don't know how much folks put stock in PFF grades out there, but he was far and away the highest graded USC player. It was passing the eye test as well. It wasn't like we were surprised to see that alignment. He's been really, really good this year. He's taken a really step forward. And I think the safest thing to say is I don't think anybody at USC expects him to play on Saturday. No official word, no out designation yet. But my sense of it is that's not going to be an option, and that's a problem for sure for them. As far as guys who are left in that group, I think you're looking at Kamari Ramsey in the secondary, has been a really hard-hitting, impactful guy. Jalen Smith, minus the Minnesota game, has been excellent on the corners. So their perimeter guys have shown some promise. I think it's not going to be individual talent that gives Penn State trouble. It's going to be a scenario where USC is able to put them into lower leverage downs, right? Put them into third and long type situations. And then as a group, maybe you start to see some of those splash plays and kind of the chaos going. I think the first step, though, is putting Penn State in those kind of situations. I looked at the stats, I think a week ago. I think going into the UCLA game, Aller wasn't even averaging 20 passes a game. And Miller Moss is over 40 passes a game. So I think one of the kind of quick hit ways of looking at this is which team gets the other guy to play their game. I don't think Penn State, I'm sure Penn State has confidence in a veteran quarterback. I don't think they want to see him throw 41 passes or have to throw 41 passes to win. And, conversely, if his numbers are down to where they usually are in terms of attempts, it probably means Penn State's running the ball, and it probably means USC is not really in the game.
Yeah, it is really a different style of way these teams have approached the matchups, especially at the quarterback position. And Drew Aller has been able to lean on that ground game against Illinois a couple weeks ago. That ground game really just took over and led the way in a ranked victory. We'll see what it looks like in LA. I want to finish with this one with you, RJ. USC will pull off the upset on Saturday and ultimately, I know it's still fairly early in the week, but I'm going to put you on the spot. How do you see this one playing out from a score prediction standpoint?
So it's tough for there to be just one if to get to a USC win. But if I'm going to triage it, if I'm going to say, all right, what's the one thing they're going to have to do? If they protect Miller Moss, they're going to be in that game for 4 quarters. I think that they can move the ball and score if they give him time to operate. As far as how I see the game playing out, to be honest with you, look, I watched Penn State against Bowling Green. I watched them against UCLA. I thought a really good defense has gotten better in between those games. Obviously, I defer to your to your analysis there on that, but I feel like the the pass rush and the line play I saw from Penn State on both sides of the ball last Saturday, USC has yet to prove it can handle that for 4 quarters. And until I see them do it, it's hard for me to expect that to happen. So, I think right now, if I just have to, and I hate doing this, by the way, but if I had to roll with something, I'm thinking probably along the lines of Penn State 31, USC 21-24, something in that realm. I think Penn State has shown it can shut down good quarterbacks. It's shown it can rush the passer. USC has not shown it can protect the passer consistently enough. That's not a good formula, as you were mentioning in terms of the alignment for USC. That's not what you want coming into Saturday.
RJ Abeytia covers USC. He does a lot for the 247 Sports Network out there in Southern California. We appreciate you making some time for us. We talked about this way back in the summer, about this Big Ten clash, and here we are, man. I hope you're enjoying the ride. I know it's been a little tricky for the Trojans so far, but we're happy to have you in our conference coverage and happy to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. Anytime.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions 247 podcast. I think we have a better understanding of what awaits the Nittany Lions out in Los Angeles, thanks to RJ. Before him, you heard from Tyler Calvaruso breaking down the latest in Nittany Lions recruiting, a lot on the flip front to monitor over the next couple of months. For now, stepping aside, we're back on the practice field Wednesday evening. Look for our coverage coming out of that, including updates on player availability, who was out at practice, who wasn't. We'll hear from James Franklin. We'll get a few players as well. And then the very next day, Thursday, USC is the destination for Penn State as they head out a day earlier than normal for their first conference clash with the Trojans. I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 247 podcast.